welcome panel. Here to my left is Debbie Critchfield. She is the president of the State Board of Education, and she is also the co-chair of the Governor's Task Force, Our Kids, Idaho's Future. Sitting next to Debbie is Bill Gilbert. Bill is managing partner of the Caprock Group here in Boise. He's also a member of Idaho Business for Education and a member of our board, but he's also the co-chair with Debbie of the Our Kids, Idaho's Future Governor's Task Force. Next to Bill is John Young from Coeur d'Alene. John owns Young Construction in Coeur d'Alene. I'm also proud to say that he's an IBE member, but he's also a member of the Workforce Development Council and the executive committee of the council as well. So he's kind of in both partner groups. Next to John is Kurt Liebig. Kurt is the chair of Red Built LLC here in Boise. Again, an IBE member. He's also the vice chair of Idaho Business for Education. But he is also playing a key role on the Governor's Task Force. He chaired the committee on budgets and budget stabilization. So he's been very engaged, and he serves on the full task force. So welcome, you guys.
Thank you.
I'll just swing this around. Debbie, I'd like to start with, or Bill, one of you.
Sure.
What do you guys hope to achieve with the task force? What is your vision for the results there?
I think it's important to, before we maybe talk about what we hope to achieve, it's the governor did a great job of teeing it up at lunch. I think it's appropriate to talk about where we are. If we can harken back to 2013, the original task force that was put together was the first real attempt in a long time to bring all of the stakeholders in education together to start a conversation about how we move education forward in the state. And it was a fantastic effort that I think not only repaired but enhanced a lot of relationships among the different stakeholders across the state, from business to education leaders to legislators and others. I view this task force, and I know the governor does as well. I think Debbie and I have had lots of conversations about this. And I should say something at the outset. I couldn't have a better co-chair. Frankly, it really helps having the president of the State Board of Education as your co-chair, because the institutional knowledge there is just incredible. And coming at it a bit more from the business perspective and from an outsider, my goal at the outset was and has been for this task force to be an evolution of what has been happening in this state over the last number of years. And the best part about this task force has been, again, stakeholders from all of the different constituencies relative to education leaders, both classroom leaders at administration level, at the school district level, at the state level, legislators, business people, folks from the universities, everybody coming together to talk about how we continue to improve education in Idaho, and particularly around two goals. Obviously, the governor mentioned both of them. K-12 literacy and college and career readiness. So everything that we have done as a task force and everything we're continuing to do is with that as the kind of guide star, that it's about improving student outcomes and student achievement, particularly around those couple of areas. But it's also about continuing to get all of these stakeholders to communicate, talk, and continue to cooperate. And I would tell you one of the overarching goals that I feel like we've already achieved, there's a long ways to go on many other things, is a continuation of that conversation that began in 2013 and that continues today. I think the relationships that are created, you used earlier when you got back up on stage, Rod, the idea of collaboration, the collaboration that's occurred. And I look around the room, and there's a number of people in this room, frankly, that are either on the task force or on subcommittees or have been helpful to us in this process. And I just think about that shared knowledge, that shared experience can do nothing but improve outcomes in Idaho for our students. And so one of the greatest things is that as an outcome. Beyond that, as we move to our recommendations and and the governor does what he will with those recommendations and in conjunction with the legislature, if we can simply improve student achievement around those two goals, we will move the state forward. If in doing so also we can honor the profession, which is education in Idaho, we will achieve our goal. One of the things that I think the 13 Task Force did well that we're trying to continue is we have a great debt of gratitude to the people in our classrooms and that are in our schools across the state, and we need to honor and raise that profession. We ask a lot of that profession. As the governor said, it gets more complicated all the time. Part of our job is to remove barriers and help them to be successful. That's where I came at it, from an outsider's perspective, if you will, at the outset.
Thank you. Debbie?
Only thing I remember from that.
I think that the bill's referencing of the 2013 task force is important. Leading up to this, there were many that were doubtful or annoyed that here we go again with another task force, and are we going to throw everything out that we've done? Is this the change of the day? And that was not the intent of this particular group. This was to build upon the good work that had been done, what's working well, what isn't, how do we make the strides that we need to make. We see the data, we see the results. It feels like we're doing better than what we are when we look at some of the data. Why isn't that those numbers, why don't they reflect that feeling? And as this group has got together, and I know we'll talk about the 4 subcommittees, those were divided, or four focus areas were put together in the committee structure so that we would be able to take the time to really, in a detailed fashion, learn and study and understand how we can improve in those areas.
Thank you. John, I'd like to ask you, what do you think, as you're on the Workforce Development Council and you're a member of Idaho Business for Education and you're an employer, what do you think employers around the state of Idaho should be doing to respond to some of the changes we've heard today about the change in the workforce? What should employers be doing?
Well, I think I'm going to start with a little bit of history first. Is a lot of talk about task force, and so the Workforce Development Task Force started in 2017, and one of the overlying things that they came out with is they wanted to increase engagement between business and education. And there were 3 primary tracks that they picked up: continuing education, connecting education to careers. There was strengthening career advising, and then there was public engagement. And it's really important. We talk about this on the Workforce Training Council all the time. We talk about the sightlines. The sightlines are for those group of students or those people that are underemployed, about giving them a sight to a career, a clear line to a career. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is if business helps engage with education to show what those different career tracks are and what the needs are out there. The legislature has very generously supported this over the last number of years. I think about $9 million last year for continuing career guidance at the college and K through 12 levels. And what we have to do is we have to leverage that. We can put all the career guidance out there that we can, but if business isn't jumping out there and being a resource to these career counselors, then we're not doing our job. Outreach, the neat thing about the legislation, well, neat, I guess, because I'm the chair of the Outreach Committee, is it gives us some funds. As the legislature, when they passed the legislation that put the Workforce Development Council into place in its current form 2 years ago, actually allowed that we could use some of our workforce development funds, which are paid for by employers all over the state of Idaho through their state insurance premiums, that we could take some of those funds and we could do outreach activities. So we can go ahead and connect job seekers with education, or take some of our educational institutions and take some of their programs and leverage those through outreach activities. I think the biggest challenge is that Idaho is diverse. I mean, we're very, very rural still, and yet we have some population centers like the Boise area and up in Kootenai County and over in southeastern Idaho. And then on the other side, we're very diverse in terms of business. Idaho has a lot of small businesses. And those small businesses, it's 99.2% of the businesses in Idaho are small business as defined by the SBA. Those small businesses employ 58% of the employees in Idaho. So that means that there's about 2,000 companies out there that employ the other 42% of the employees. Now that 2%, the large companies in Idaho do a great job of looking out ahead and engaging workforce development because they have the tools in order to go ahead and do that. What we have to do is through associations and trade relationships and getting together in groups like this, is we have to take those small businesses and help them be successful in moving forward with workforce development.
Thank you. Kurt, I'd like to talk to you about the budget. You chaired the budget committee for the task force, and you did some great work, I think, in sort of creating a better framework of understanding about where we've been over the last 10 years in education funding and where we may be going with that. Could you, for the group here who didn't have the benefit of sitting through those meetings and hearing the way you set up that framework from your own research, could you explain what the budgetary situation in Idaho looks like for us?
Sure, thanks, Rod. There we go. I come from the business world as well, and so prior to the governor asking me to serve on this task force, I had spent absolutely zero time ever studying the K-12 budget. And so my comments today are just simply my observations, having spent the last 4 months spending a lot of time looking at the overall budget and where we've been. It's easy to fall into the trap that, geez, if we just had more money, we could improve outcomes. And I'm not sure that's where the answer is for us moving forward. So let me kind of give you a historical perspective. The state has invested a significant amount more money in K-12 education over the last 5 years, to the tune of $500 million. The problem is, coming out of the Great Recession from 2009 to 2014, we didn't increase spending at all. And so a huge portion of what we've spent over the last 5 years really has been catch up from what we didn't spend from 2009 to 2014. I think that's an important point to understand. Having said that, though, we're still spending $500 million more per year than we were 5 years ago. So that's where we've been. If you look forward, the conclusion I've come to is that we're always going to have scarce resources as an education system, and here's why. The state general fund is roughly $4 billion. And as we've heard a couple times this morning, half of that money goes to K-12 education. So we're talking about $2 billion a year that goes to K-12 education. And then supplemental levies and federal dollars all on top of that. So the system spends closer to $3 billion, but just from a state standpoint, $2 billion goes to education. The governor mentioned the sucking sound from other parts of the budget, so Medicaid expansion, corrections. There's going to be a lot of pull on the legislature moving forward to even maintain that 50% that goes to K-12 education today. But if we just assume that we can't get more than that for K-12 education, we assume that we're going to continue to get 50%. If you do the high-level math and you say, all right, we got a $4 billion general fund budget as a state, the projections I've seen, given the growth in the state, is that the state general fund will probably grow about 5% a year. So 5% of $4 billion is, we can expect roughly $200 million more in revenue at the state level. So if you say then half of that goes to K-12 education, that's just in rough numbers $100 million. So if we assume we have $100 million incrementally moving forward, that sounds like a lot of money, but when you factor in the impact of student growth, which historically has been 1.3%, and I don't see any reason why that's going to change. So if you assume just to stay even in terms of the amount of money we spend per kid, we're going to need 1.3% more. So 1.3% on $2 billion we spend, that's $26 million. And then you add inflation on top of that, and the CPI has been about 1.8%. You have to assume the same inflationary pressures that we deal with in our daily lives impact the cost structures of our schools. So you take 1.8% times $2 billion, that's $36 million. So just to stay even, in terms of the inflation-adjusted cost per kid, that's $60 million of the $100 million that's available to us. And so you have sort of $40 million a year to do new stuff. And that's not a lot of money when you spread it across 115 districts and 50 some odd charters, and particularly when you're talking about some major initiatives, whether it's building out the master rung of the career ladder or expanding pre-K or early learning education, or expanding social health for our kids. I mean, all of those things have price tags to them, and if you have $40 million a year, that's just not a lot of money. So I come back and I say, all right, so what would I do in my business? Well, what we do in our business, and when I go through the budgeting process, is the same thing happens. My executive team comes to me with their budget, and we always have 20 more things that the team wants to do than we can afford to do. And so what do we have to do? We have to say, all right, so where are we going to get the greatest return? And I think that's a position we're going to be in every school district and school in our state, is we're going to have to make trade-offs. And I think the governor's done a great thing for us by saying, look, here are the priorities. It's literacy, getting every kid being able to read by 3rd grade, and career readiness. And doesn't mean we don't do the other stuff, but if we have scarce dollars and we're having to decide whether we invest in literacy or uniforms for the new football team, we're going to have to make those trade-offs and go after our priorities. And I don't think that's going to change for all the reasons that I talked about.
So this question is for everybody, and maybe just weigh in when a thought comes to you. But given those budget realities, you're predicating that on that we're having a good year like we have for the last several years. But there's also, and the governor wanted you to look at this, that there's potential storm clouds on the horizon for the economy. We're in the largest expansion in the history of the United States. So how can we maintain momentum, achieve what the task force wants to have us achieve, what the governor wants us to achieve, given some of the budget limitations we may have moving forward?
I think one word, focus. I should have said at the outset, I think one of the great differences between where we were in 2013 and where we are now, 2013, I think the governor may have referenced this, produced a fairly long list, 21 recommendations. And for the point that the state was at that time, that was probably appropriate. But I think we all know in our businesses and in the organizations that we're a part of, you can't have 21 strategic initiatives and expect to accomplish any of them. The real power, I think, with this task force is not only having all the stakeholders, but focus. And that North Star being K-12 literacy, but particularly focused on K-3, and then career readiness. There are naturally going to have to be trade-offs. And if we get an economic environment, which is likely, in the coming months and years, that is more difficult, and the budget situation does get more difficult, that if we've had the conversation around focus and all the stakeholders understand, what the priorities are and what we're trying to move the dial on and why it's so important, why literacy is the focus of the governor and what that leads to down the line, and why, the focus on appropriate pathways and career readiness and those things, why that's the focus. If we can maintain that focus through this, it's about having a long-term plan and education. One of the greatest things that came out of 13 as well, that it's a continuation, is in all of our businesses, we don't operate on annual plans. We operate on long-term planning, that you make adjustments to strategic planning, that you make adjustments to course corrections over time. For the longest time in education, one of the things was there was no long-term plan for education. And I feel like what we have as an opportunity now, and what the governor is demanding, is a long-term plan as it relates to education that all the stakeholders can well understand, but then within that you can make rational prioritization decisions and have conversations around that, because everybody understands where we're going as a group.
So
Let me, if I could just describe maybe what the focus looked like. So to understand how we got from here, or how we'll get to here. So Bill and I, what are we at, 25 meetings since June 1st?
I think, yeah, something like that.
Yes, we're there. And we participated to listen so that we could understand the background leading up to a final vote from the full task force. There were several of the big notepad pages that were stuck to the walls in each of the subcommittees on all sorts of ideas, programs, initiatives, et cetera, to help tackle literacy and college and career readiness in the context of the 4 subcommittees. And the committees coming up with the ideas was very easy. Getting them to, in Bill's famous words, discipline themselves in a way that they were able to refine and streamline what they wanted to take to the full committee was no small task. And so that happened over and over in 4 committees, leading up to the meeting that we had last week at the University of Idaho, where we said, all right, here's the handful of priority recommendations from each of the subcommittees. As a main task force, it's our job now to decide what those top 4 are. And there was a lot of discussion and interest from other subcommittee members on why did you decide to do this, or here was a report that helped lead us to this conclusion. And I want to explain that the work, there may not have been taken so much time in the full task force meeting describing how they got to that process, but it was a refining process over several months.
This focus on literacy, take that one first. What do you think that's going to look like when the task force makes its recommendations in November? How are we going to prioritize literacy and achieve what the governor wants, which is to have every child read proficiently by 4th grade? How are we going to be able to do that?
I could probably start off with that one. Thinking of the rural, so one of the subcommittees, just quickly, if that's okay, if we go through, Kurt was the chair of the K-12 budget stability. We also had a teacher pipeline subcommittee, rural and underserved student subcommittee, and safety and operations. So thinking about literacy and the recommendation coming out of the rural and underserved subcommittee, it was on an optional all-day kindergarten that would be state funded. So that was their proposal and their top priority as presented to the main task force. 104 of the 115 school districts that we have in the state are classified as rural according to how Idaho defines it. That means 393 schools out of 728 are rural. And this isn't new news, but we know what is new is that school districts that have been able to either tap into their discretionary funds or go to their local taxpayers by way of supplemental levies that offer that, the data shows us that return on investment is substantial.
Yeah, I think that's, there's also, I don't know if you want me to get there now, Rod, but there's also going to be a recommendation likely from the main task force with a focus on student achievement and for essentially an accountability recommendation, and it recognizes that Idaho is a local control state, and what we really need to do is arm our communities with the information they need to understand what is happening and the achievement that's going on in their schools. And as everybody knows, one of the things about education is it's a complicated mosaic, and it's a nuanced one as well, and it doesn't lend itself to, easy summation. And so often you can take a piece of data and find another piece that there's great achievement on, and you can find another one that shows the difference. And we beat ourselves and our schools up pretty aggressively, in all states too, but particularly in Idaho. And my perspective from coming again from the outside, I was fortunate to, and maybe a little bit unfortunate, at times it felt like I was drinking from several fire hoses at once, but not having spent my career in education, coming from the business world. As Debbie said, one of the things the governor tasked myself in particular with was trying to provide some focus and discipline to the process. And as I looked at it, to me, there was a couple of things. Accountability in business and in most organizations, leadership creates culture and culture creates results. I think we all know that on some level. And that what we have to do is create cultures and leadership in our communities and in our schools at the leadership level that demand the results that we want to see. Well, part of that is simplification of measures. And so one of the things that's likely to come forward and gets to your literacy question is a focus on, there is a measure that is out there. It's not the only measure, but it's a good measure that has been agreed upon that the state has been using, and it's in K through 3, and it's the IRI, the Idaho Reading Indicator. And that it's not about the actual score as much as it's growth in the IRI. How are we doing over time? Growth in the IRI, and then more importantly, growth in the IRI around an appropriate cohort. So for example, a school in Boise, Idaho might look very, very different from an inputs perspective than a school in somewhere in remote Idaho. And I might want to mention too, one of the things that became clear in this process is Idaho actually really has three classifications if you think about it. We have urban, rural, And then we really have remote. And the challenges of those remote schools, there are schools that are classified as rural, but where there's an opportunity to really collaborate, right, because of distance. There's an opportunity, there's enough schools, enough districts, enough professionals to be able to make that happen. And then there are schools, and I'll pick on an often used example in this process of, and a place where my family is from, the Bruno-Grandview area. That's a remote district. That has a very different challenge. Well, looking at let's say, Bruno Elementary against an elementary school in Boise, Idaho, for that IRI score, they have totally different inputs, whether it relates to ELL or free and reduced lunch or other those factors. What becomes important if I'm in a community and I want to understand, are we hitting that literacy mark? How do we look at that over time? I want to understand, how is my community and how are our schools doing against schools and districts that look like us across the state of Idaho from an inputs perspective? What kind of growth are they achieving versus what kind of growth are we achieving? And then that leads to the natural question, not from well, gosh, why is their score better, but what are they doing that we can replicate? What practices, what things, whether maybe it's all-day K, maybe it's something else, maybe it's collaboration with industry, maybe, who knows? We went through lots of examples, and my perspective from an accountability framework is first simplifying and allowing the communities to understand that without getting lost in this kind of opaque, large group of inputs. And if we can start with a framework that starts there, and we can get the communities to really understand at that earliest point on something that people agree on as a measure, how are we looking at growth and how are we looking at against communities that look like ours, that's an accountability framework that we can move forward with, and then the communities themselves can add the appropriate things to over time. So I think, how do you get at the literacy goals? How do you prioritize, and how do you show that? I think the task force, that's one of the things that we started to focus on, is creating that framework and giving it to our communities and doing training. Senator Lent and who was in the audience I saw earlier, and others have been working on, and IBE, around a framework for continuing to improve that training. We ask a lot of not only of our administrators across the state, but our local trustees and our school boards. And we don't always provide the resources, I don't think. They don't always have the background and resources that they need, and I think that came up in one of the comments earlier as well, to look at that and say, are we getting appropriate growth?
Yeah.
So it really is a mosaic, and it's something that doesn't lend itself to sloganism, and it takes digging in, and that's what this task force has really done. But if we can simplify and we can focus around things like that literacy thing and looking at appropriate growth, I think we have the opportunity to move the ball forward.
So this next question is interesting. Great segue. Bill, you mentioned a couple times the community, and this question, anybody jump in, but the audience person who asked this question is, what can the community or the public do in our communities in Idaho to support the ultimate recommendations from the task force? What can they do? What can the people of Idaho do to support you? Anybody want to jump in?
You want to take this?
Well, I think if I take the two, literacy, it's getting every community member to read to their kids every night. I mean, you think about how much, and that's easier said than done, but if we had engaged families, engaged communities, and engaged local libraries, and everybody was pulling together around improving literacy, that I think would have a huge impact. And then on the career and college and career readiness, I think businesses, and we're guilty of, we have to get more involved. Particularly, throughout my career, and I'm guilty of this, I've sort of said, look, I'll take whatever the education system produces, that'll be the input. We'll go try to hire the best and the brightest out of that group. I don't think that works anymore. I think we have to get much more engaged, partnering with our schools, joining school boards, being part of engagement teams, supporting CTE programs with resources. I think we've got to really raise the bar for businesses, and it's particularly powerful in our smaller rural areas. I mean, if you're the biggest lumber mill in town, you've really got to be engaged with that school system. And so I'm sort of carrying, we don't manufacture anything here in Idaho, but I'm starting to take that thinking to Oregon where we do manufacture, because I've realized that if we're not engaged with the local schools, we're not doing our jobs.
I would add that when we talk about accountability, and I know I can speak for Bill and even Kurt, and I won't for John because I haven't talked to you about this, but we believe that the ultimate accountability for a school is in the community, and that they are accountable to the parents and to the students. And how do we engage our parents in a way that they realize that they are the ones for which all of this is happening? And that looks differently. You can, as of right now, you can go on, the Department of Ed has got a great report card online that you can go and make some of these comparisons. Not all of the points that we'd like to see, I think, are on there now, but I think that's a start to understand, know about your child's school, understand what is it they're doing. Every school district submits every year a continuous improvement plan. What's in that plan? How are they spending their money? They submit a literacy plan. How are they using those funds? Those funds have been doubled in the last couple of years. What are they doing there? How does that impact your child, your school, your town? And then when you understand that, then you're able to be an advocate. And at some point, this recommendation, sooner than later, as the governor referenced earlier, Bill and I are going to take him recommendations that the committee has said these are one or two top priorities. And if you personally believe that those are good things, speak to your legislators, because they are going to have to be a partner. It really is a partnership and a team approach in getting this done.
That's a good question, actually. After you make the recommendations, in some ways the real work begins, right? Because you can make recommendations, but the legislature, the governor can propose, but the legislature decides, right? So how can the people of Idaho, people in this room, help ensure that the hard work that the task force has done for the last 6 months actually gets a hearing and a chance to get implemented?
Again, I think the powerful component is working within your own legislative districts. First, you need to know what those are, and as a task force and as a state board of education, and I'm assuming that the governor's office will do this too, that we need to communicate with the state how we got here and why we believe that this is important, and how we believe that it will impact students not just next year but down the road. And then once you understand that, then you can go to the next step, which is communicate with your local legislators to say, I think this is a good idea, and this is how it would impact me and my school. We not only appreciate but fully understand the budgetary implications coming into this year. That we're not seeing the growth that we have seen over the last few years. We get that. And so you're not going to see recommendations that are far and above anything that would realistically be able to be accomplished. However, there are also some things that I would anticipate that will be a little bit of a stretch. And it will take an effort of being very deliberate and strategic about the budgeting. So
this next question actually comes from the audience, and it's kind of related to the other ones we were talking about, but I want to make sure I asked it. And John, coming from Coeur d'Alene, it's not a small city by any means, but the question is, how can we get our civic groups like Rotary and others and our business community, especially in our smaller towns across Idaho, more engaged in education to solve some of these things we heard this morning about the changing workforce and pathways for students?
I think one of the biggest things we can do is just, again, through trade associations, through our Chamber of Commerce's, through these different entities, IBE, is we have to reach out. We have to reach out to those businesses that aren't engaged, that aren't participating. You probably know the numbers better than I do about what the participation rate is. Businesses tend to show up, but businesses don't always tend to show up and get things done when it comes to doing things that are outside of their primary business focuses. So what we have to do is we have to reach out and demonstrate how important it is that not only do you show up, but you show up and you get something done. We've got to invest in our future or we won't have a future. I mean, we're riding the wave right now. Mm-hmm. And if we don't take advantage of this momentum that we have to make sure that our workforce is going to be well educated and well skilled and has the skill sets in the future, especially with this massive evolution of skills. I mean, they're changing daily, weekly, monthly. I mean, we've got to have a system in place where our workforce can gain these skills as quickly as they're becoming relevant, so that our businesses can be successful when this wave stops. How? I guess I wish I had an answer. I mean, through the outreach committee, on the Workforce Development Council, we're reaching out. I mean, Katie ought to have running shoes on, as much work as she's doing for us, going out to different school districts across the state, touching bases with chambers, going through some of the regional Department of Labor. I mean, just trying to reach out and touch businesses and show them how important it is to make this connection with education, to serve on advisory boards. Every school district out there that has CTE programs has advisory boards. The workforce training centers at our community colleges have advisory boards. The community colleges have advisory boards. We need to get businesses involved sitting on those boards. I know some of the educators out there in the crowd are probably shaking their head because they work with these advisory boards, and guess what? Business isn't always showing up. I know that because we participate, my company participates in a handful of them, and we'll go to a meeting and 1 or 2 out of 8 or 9 people will show up. So we have to get business to get involved and see how important it is and look beyond the bottom line, but look at our futures.
Phil?
I think one thing that I would say both to this audience, but to the taxpayers and citizens of Idaho at large, again, coming from the outside is, and to the heart of your question, which is how do the citizens of Idaho and how do the people in this room get behind and support what's happening with the task force in the direction that we're trying to go, and that the education system is trying to go, is I did come without a lot of background, and the good news is you don't come with a lot of baggage when you come the way I did, but you also don't have a lot of the institutional knowledge and memory. So I was able to look at the things that were happening with a fresh set of eyes, excuse me. And I would tell you the thing that I was most impressed by is if you think about the education system in our state as a giant elephant, and everybody's sort of seeing their piece of the elephant, right? But they're not necessarily always seeing the entire animal. And they're trying to describe their piece of it, and that can lead to some pretty interesting variability in description and some disagreements. But what I saw in all of these was that this was the best and has been and continues to be the best thinking of a lot of people that have come to the table earnestly and honestly and have left the sacred cows out of the room. I was really curious about that, frankly, when I got involved. And whether it's been teachers, administrators, superintendents, folks from the state board, the State Department, legislators, some incredible legislators that have participated in the process, business folks. I mean, someone like with Kurt's skill and ability, now in his quick little summation of the budget, you can see why I wanted him to be the budget subcommittee chairman. This is the thinking of, and the result, whatever the recommendations that come forward, a lot of hard work and a lot of really tough, critical questions that were asked in some rooms where things got a bit uncomfortable, frankly, at times. And what's come out of that is a work product that has the support of all of these constituencies. So from my perspective, to a certain extent, what else could you get behind, right? This is the system. And if we really, truly believe that the human capital of this state is the most important asset that we have, and it's been talked about all day long, this is about improving the outcomes and the achievement abilities for that human capital moving forward. And it's the best thinking of everybody related to that. To me, that's the reason to look at what the task force comes with, read the reports, and support it.
Debbie?
I was elected to my local school board in 2001, and over the last so many years have been involved in education at one level or another. And in the last, I would say, 2 years, I have been so encouraged by the opening of doors from a variety of perspectives, business talking to education, and for whatever reasons, and I don't think that it was done deliberately to exclude business leaders from educational decisions at the local level. It just was. I don't know why. But now I see and know of dozens of examples where industry has come to local tech centers or school districts to say, hey, this is what we need. And I know it's been frustrating in the business community that education doesn't move as quickly as perhaps business demands need. However, we see more and more partnerships. Fundamentally, I believe that the biggest gap we have between making this type of relationship expand the way we need it to, it's just communication. A couple of years ago, we had McCain Foods in the Magic Valley area needed a certain type of worker, and they were willing to work and open up an apprenticeship. Well, you've got two school districts. You have Cassia County and Minidoka separated by the Snake River. And he basically, the general manager said, I'm not going to support two school districts. I want you to get together, and I want you to work with CSI, and I want you to come up with something. And we finished the second year of that. We've got more students starting a new cohort. And from that, we've had other industry folks come and say, well, could we do an apprenticeship in diesel mechanic? Could we do something with HVAC? Could we do something with auto body? And it was one person starting that conversation. And it sounds overly simplified to portray it like that, but it really is that simple. How can we help? Schools don't always have the money. That's where the business side comes in. The schools can make adaptations for things that work within the region and within the small community. And it doesn't happen overnight, but you can, within a short period of time, have very successful examples. And I think that we know of many. There should and needs to be more.
So this question, great segue for this question. I think this question kind of falls in that category of a communications. And I'll read the question and then anybody weigh in on it. But it actually goes at the business community. Business also creates roadblocks, the writer says, to school placing students. And the two issues, and I actually hear this from educators myself, is that there's this professional insurance requirement that they, for internships and clinical apprenticeships, there has to be this professional insurance. And the second thing is that student has to be 18 years of old, 18 or older to be on the work site. How do we remove these roadblocks? Now, I believe that this is a communications issue, but I'd like to hear everybody's reaction.
I'll lead out just because of the experience that we've had in the Mini-Cassia area, that you can have a 16-year-old in the workplace. The STRAP, and I can't think of there's so many acronyms in education, but anyway, it's a federally approved apprenticeship program, and there is an application process, but if you're committed to what you're doing, that should not be a barrier to keep you from doing that. And there was I'm not sure on the insurance part, but there are ways to work within that framework to adjust for the age depending on the circumstances and so forth.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Bill?
I think to what Kurt said earlier, and this is from a business perspective, and we have a habit as I think as business people to particularly when it seems like when it comes to education, to show up and say, well, we're here. Now what are you going to do, education community? And the reality is that isn't digging in. And I think that, what I am encouraged by is I think there is an ever-increasing recognition, and IBE has played obviously no small role in that. The Workforce Development Council has played no small role in that. I think the task force is helpful. I think there are a lot of things to recognizing that it's not a singular event, that if we truly, again, want to very selfishly, for my business or for yours or for Kurt's or any of ours, if we want to develop the human capital that we need, it's a continuous process. And that's what's become, to the point Kurt made earlier, really relevant to me in understanding that part of the reason that it can be so intimidating is because the educational system is complex. And it's complex for a whole bunch of reasons, but not the least of which is the geography and the setup of our state. Okay, That doesn't mean it's not navigable. That doesn't mean it can't be, you can't have an impact on it, but it means that that impact has to be consistent. And so as a business community, I think we have a responsibility to engage in it and to engage in it consistently if we want to demand the outcomes we're demanding.
So I just take a moderator's prerogative here to build on that question. If any employer in the audience or any educator in the audience has any questions on how to connect, I think the Workforce Development Council, pick up the phone and call Wendy and her team, because they can walk you through that. There are no roadblocks. Sure, there are roadblocks, but there are roadblocks we can deal with. And McCain Foods and what they're doing down in Burley that Debbie's talked about a couple times, perfect example of that. So this is one case where communication should not be a barrier, where you've got the answer, people, and you can work through this.
Could I just make a plug also for externships? I know that that's a fairly recent push, but I believe the value in that, and I think it was John that brought up college and career advising. For our college and career advisors and our school counselors to understand, it's that age-old question, what am I ever going to use this information? Or I'm interested in this, what kind of jobs are out there? We have to work on, we as in a community, need to work on instructing those that are advising our students on what those jobs are. And so if you have opportunities to have teachers come into your workplace during the summer or for 6 weeks, or however you want to do that, I am encouraged that there are teachers that are interested in doing that, or sponsoring events where you invite your college and career advisor and school counselors into your business to help them understand what it is that you do and what you're looking for. So when they sit down across the table from a student and a parent, their junior and senior year, to help them navigate what their next steps are, in their mind, they're going through the file cabinet that they've got, and that student says, well, I'm interested in biology, but I don't know what I can do with that. That person is ready to say, you could work here, 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 or here. These are people that are looking for individuals that are trained in biology.
John.
Yeah, let me build on that. Excuse me. Let me build on that just a little bit. Debbie, as you know, both the State Board and the Workforce Development Council is working on rolling out Next Steps, and I don't know exactly what the time frame is right now, but Next Steps is going to be such a huge asset for these counselors and for people in looking for jobs, because it crosses and brings all those different job opportunities or career opportunities right to your computer screen, right? I mean, you can say, I'm interested in something in the biologic field or something, or wood products, and you can look at all the different things that you can do, or my career track is in mathematics. So, you know, here's an asset that's coming on board, and once it's on board, we have to share it. I mean, it's on everybody in this room, it's on businesses, it's on education, it's on workforce professionals to share this asset so we can get it out there so that it can be utilized.
So I sort of know the answer, or what I would say the answer to this question is, but I think it's a very insightful question, and especially for the business people on the panel to weigh in on. The question basically is, with an unemployment rate of 2.9%, sure, the business community is really a partner with education and community, but what happens when the unemployment rate goes to 6 or 10%? Will the business community stay engaged in this effort to help strengthen our student outcomes in the state of Idaho?
Do you want to?
Why don't you start?
I mean, you got to keep in mind the unemployment. What did you say? The unemployment 2 point.
Well, it's 2.9 roughly.
That understates.
What happens when it goes
yeah,
6 or 10?
That understates the challenge that business is having today, because it. You know, I think it was mentioned earlier, there are roughly 150 million jobs in the United States. Last number I saw, that there's 7 million unfilled jobs. So there's 7 million jobs out there that we need to hire, and the reason we're not filling them is because the skill set isn't there. There isn't a match between what we need and what the folks have. So even in a recessionary environment, I think you're going to see business all over this issue of trying to match the demands of the jobs with of what the students have throughout their life.
I think the thing I would say is, there's also a maturation of business in general, in the sense that the types of jobs and the kind of economy that we have and we will continue to have in the future is highly more dependent upon the best human capital that we can get. And that's only going to continue to be the case, right? Because if you think about the sophistication of every single industry, it's increasing. And so the need for skilled labor and the need for skilled workers and the need for, frankly, workers that can think critically, are adaptive, and that are sort of self-reliant, that's not going to decrease regardless of economic environment and unemployment rate. And I think as a business community, it feels like there's been an awakening a little bit, but particularly in Idaho, that you can't create that out of thin air. And so it takes consistent engagement. So I would say emphatically that, yeah, there will be consistent engagement, because the types of people that we need and the types of jobs that we need to fill demand it. You know, at the end of the day, businesses are rational. We're going to do what we need to do to get the workers that we need.
Don't you also think, like, this conference is a great example of this, that there's great, this is a very, we had everybody stand this morning. There, you know, there's educators here, business leaders here, policymakers here. And don't you think this isn't just about specific issues that we're dealing with, but we're really looking at a cultural change in Idaho that has really emerged over the last 5 or 6 years? And the task force is a reflection of that as well.
Without question.
Isn't it really a cultural change that's happening, not any specific issue?
I just think about the way that the conversations went in the task force. Again, and those that know me know that I'm not a particularly Pollyannish kind of person, and so I know some of the things that I'm saying might sound that way. But I've been incredibly impressed with the level of discourse around it in all of these meetings, in subcommittee and task force meetings, and I think that's a reflection of, yes, things are actually changing in Idaho. We're not there yet by any stretch of the imagination, and frankly, we still have an achievement gap. We still have a lot of things we've got to do. But there's a recognition and an understanding of the problem, and there's a commonality of understanding of where everybody's coming from, and there's a discourse that allows that to at least begin to change. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a cultural sea change, particularly in a state as geographically and broadly kind of diverse as we are.
I have to imagine that 100 years ago, that these types of, or longer, these types of conversations are ongoing. They're never going to change. How do we adapt and change for the needs of the time? And 50 years from now, they'll probably look back on this task force work and either say, oh, good job, or what were they thinking, or something in between that. But we know what our challenges are right now. We know what the needs are. I believe that we have the eyes are focused, all the eyes are focused in the right direction, and then you have business talking to education, talking to others, and working within communities, and how do we leverage libraries and community centers and all of that, recognizing that it is all leading to creating that culture. And I look at it as, in the frame of this isn't a no-fail option. It's just, where are we on that continuum? How close are we to getting and accomplishing the needs that we have, not right now, but looking forward into any types of forecasts or predictions that we had, regardless of what the unemployment rate is. We're always going to need skilled laborers for whatever the industry is.
Yeah.
Hey, Rod, can I make one more comment on
Kurt.
culture?
Yeah.
I think the cultural change is really important here. And if I reflect back on my career, when I've gone into a business in a leadership role, and I've said, all right, so how am I going to change a culture that needs to be changed? What I don't do is I don't go in and find the person that's doing something wrong and punish them, and set that as the example. What I've tried to do in terms of leading change is look for the behaviors and the performance that's really setting the tone and recognize that. And because when people see what you as a leader recognize, they want to emulate that. But I think in Idaho, we're guilty of the former of what I described, which is we look for the data that suggests we're failing, and then we talk about that all the time. And we don't look for the successes and the great things that are happening in the system and celebrating those. And I think until we as a community of Idaho leaders, no matter where we come from, until we start really recognizing the positive things that are going on in the system and celebrating that, I think it's going to be tough to drive the cultural change that we need.
I would like to touch on something that it first emerged, as far as I know, in our HP study. We set out to talk to everybody about education, and the one issue that everybody wanted to talk about was the mental illness crisis among our students, which was kind of surprising to everybody working on that study. And that has emerged even on the task force now as something that is kind of rising a little bit to the top. So I know you can't get into the specifics right now, but help us understand this problem and what you think the task force might be looking at to at least take a step toward addressing this crisis.
Bill's pointing to me because this has been a passion of mine, and I know, and I see our superintendent standing in the back as well as hers. And one of the task force or the subcommittee was on safety and operations. And there's more to safety of schools than the hardening of schools, and how we address all levels of the social emotional learning that needs to take place, and how we help teachers with trauma-informed teaching and recognizing what those are, anything from just distress to grief, addiction, depression, suicidal ideation, and all of those things. That fundamental to everything that we do, we will not get the kind of academic achievement, growth, performance, success, however you want to term it, unless we have addressed those basic issues. This is a widespread, critical problem, school by school, and it doesn't matter where you are, if you're in West Ada or if you're in Three Creek. There are students that arrive to school that teachers are trying to navigate through that. And you will see a recommendation. Well, the main task force looked at one of several that dealt with social emotional learning. We also know on the university end, on the pre-service end for teachers, that there is more being done to help train our teachers, in addition to understanding content and having that knowledge, understanding how to work through the behavioral and emotional health. There are a lot of wonderful things happening in the state, and I'd encourage you within your own areas to recognize and tap into what is happening. However, the state has an interest here, in my opinion, in addressing that across the board.
I think it's important to remember, as it relates to student achievement, it's not only the achievement gap as it relates to those students that are experiencing that social, emotional, or behavioral challenge. It's all the students around them every day. And frankly, the disruption, at the classroom level, and what we're asking educators and frankly, counselors and other nurses and school psychologists to deal with, that's critical, but it's also the impact that it has on the other children and what that ultimately does to achievement. You can't underestimate it.
So Debbie, as president of the state board, some school districts in Idaho and across the country, I know Boise, I think Nampa as well, are looking at the community school model where we have wraparound services for the students. Do you think that's something that we should take a harder look at in Idaho?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know we don't have the time to get into it now, and I'm sorry to keep waving the Cassia County flag, but I think they've got a fantastic model that provides access to licensed clinicians for all students K-12 free of cost. And it's all been put together by way of private donations. So you want to talk about businesses stepping up, recognizing the needs. The reality is, if we don't address it at some point, so during public school, K-12, we push it to the university. And then if we don't address it there, it gets pushed to the workforce. At some level, in some way, every single person, to Bill's point, is dealing with these challenges. And we've got to start somewhere. This has just been, it hasn't been something that we've addressed in a strategic way and said deliberately, this is what we're going to do. And so I have been very heartened by the fact that this has been one of the last standing of the recommendations, that the team recognizes that this is as important of an issue as helping children be successful in reading and writing and math.
One other thing I want to touch on, I have a couple minutes, 1 minute left. Maybe Debbie or Bill touch on this. You're looking at expanding the career ladder, maybe trying to get to some targets we set several years ago of starting teacher salaries, mid-career, and also master teacher. Can you talk about that just briefly?
Well, we're still in talks. That's probably, and then that's been one of the main recommendations coming out of Kurt's. How do we do that? How do we accomplish? Initially, or originally, it was 40, 50, 60. That top rung wasn't put on. Master educator premium was put in its place, and so there's been talk of perhaps collapsing some of the extra programs into a career ladder. There's a lot of discussion yet to be had on what that looks like. Does it impact the things that we want it to? Kurt, I feel like maybe this would be a great.
Well, I think there's a
place for you.
recognition that that was a leftover recommendation from the 2013 task force, right? Which is how do we compensate our master teachers at an appropriate level to retain and attract people into the profession. And I think, as Debbie said, we fund salaries through the career ladder, which you hear a lot about, but there are also line items that have significant dollars, so leadership premiums, master educator premiums. So there's this whole discussion of how do you think through all that in the context of that broader goal of attracting and retaining master teachers to the profession.
Can I make one comment on it, Rod, before we wrap? I think it's important to remember that one of the most important functions that the career ladder serves, it's not a salary schedule. It's a reimbursement schedule, right? And so what it does at its core, and particularly the conversations around whether or not there should be a third rung, if you're in a rural or remote district that does not have significant supplemental support, and there are many communities in our state where that is the case, what you get in terms of your reimbursement from the state is what you can afford to pay. Now, that isn't true in Ada County. That isn't true in Boise schools or West Ada or Blaine County or other places. But if you are, I'll pick on Andy Grover in Melba, where he doesn't have those additional dollars, his ability to attract and retain his best employees, and this is true across many districts, the ladder has been an essential partner for him, particularly in the recruitment in the early stages. The conversation that the task force is having is how do we assist, in particular, those rural and remote districts with retention of their best educators, so that they're not only not losing their best educators to other districts, which some of that's going to happen, or other states. There's going to be a level of attrition. But we're also not losing those best educators to administration as well. That's really the focus of this conversation around the career ladder, I would say.
We're out of time, but I think it's important to recognize that these 4 people are all volunteers, and
We're not getting paid?
The pay
You're getting double what I get.
But they have given of their time and taken it away from their personal lives and their businesses to serve the state of Idaho and to serve the students of Idaho. So I think we should give them a huge round of applause.
I'll clap for you guys.
Thank you.